Welcome to our Open Heritage series of guest lectures. And my name is May Kassar, and I'm the Director of the Institute for Sustainable Heritage. But this evening is about Henry Owen John, who is the Head of International Advice at Historic England. And you can see the title of his talk behind me. But I'll tell you a little bit about Henry, who is an archaeologist by profession, and after graduating from Birmingham University in 1976, he directed rescue excavations. In 1991, he started to work at English Heritage and then took up various management positions. From 2004 to 2014, he headed the planning team in Northwest England, which advises local planning authorities on proposed changes to significant historic assets and offers grant aid towards heritage at risk. He is currently head of international advice at Historic England, and this role includes advising government and others on how best to meet obligations that flow from international heritage conventions, particularly those adopted by UNESCO. Over to you, Henry.
Thank you very much indeed, May, and good evening. And my thanks to you as well for turning out in such numbers on a cold evening. I was very privileged to receive this invitation, but I thought before getting into the sort of detail of the title of that, it might be worthwhile just taking a little bit of a step back and reminding ourselves about what UNESCO actually is and why it is there. So we can stay in this city because it was in London in 1945 when the conference that established UNESCO came into being, and it came into being at exactly the same time as the United Nations itself in November 1945. And you can see the differences that have happened since then. You still have at World Heritage Committee meetings and things like that, the country signs. I'm pleased to say we have rather more women now. I think I can spot one woman there, but I think that is probably it at that time. And that is also reflected in the language that was adopted when UNESCO was being founded. And it was recognised that the United Nations, obviously sort of set up on the sort of political and diplomatic front to sort of try to sort of work to avoid the level of horrors of the Second World War, that if it was just confined to the sort of political and diplomatic front, it wasn't going to work. And there was a need to look at education, to look at science, to look at culture, and influence the minds of men. And you'll be pleased to know that that is modified in the UNESCO website now, the minds of men and women, that the defences of peace must be constructed there if they're going to sort of have any sort of great weight or sort of credibility. So that is the underpinning element. And UNESCO's mission, as you can see here, is to contribute to this building of a culture of peace, eradication of poverty, sustainable development and intercultural dialogue through these three particular headings, the E, the S and the C of UNESCO. And the whole organisation has this ethos of peace and non-violence, and you see there the arrangement of the sort of key words that represent what UNESCO tries to do. So that, if you like, is the wider context, but it's worthwhile pointing out, I think, that UNESCO currently has 195 member states that have signed up to it and pay into it, and out of the UN countries that are sort of recognised, that they're about sort of 200. So it is the vast majority of countries recognised by the UN that are part of UNESCO. And it is the sort of member states that really sort of drive the agenda of the organisation, and it is the member states that sort of contribute to the establishing of norms and standards which those countries that sign up to the organisation are then expected to maintain. And those norms and standards then find their sort of place in the application of international conventions such as the Hague Convention on the protection of cultural property in the event of armed conflict. And what you see here is our ambassador to UNESCO, Matthew Lodge on the left, presenting last year to the outgoing director of the World Heritage Centre the UK's formal and very belated ratification of that treaty that came into being in 1954. That was an initial sort of focus, and at the moment UNESCO sort of governance, it conducts its business via committees, the General Conference of the Member States every couple of years or so, and it pursues the objectives, as I've just said, by means of international legal instruments such as conventions, and we're going to be talking about the World Heritage Convention and then drilling into the urban side of that just a little bit later on. And so in the previous slide you saw Irina Bokova, the outgoing Director General who had completed her term of office, and this is Madame Audrey Azoulay, who was a former French culture minister who is the new Director General of UNESCO as of last November. So in terms of the organisation, I've mentioned the Hague Convention, and here you can see an aerial view of a part of Liverpool in the period just after the war. And you can see the Customs House, John Foster's Custom House from the early 19th century, which is a fantastic building, which of course was really severely sort of damaged in the Second World War bombing. But you can see from that slide also that in this particular case, it was mainly damaged by incendiary bombs. And this post-war photograph shows that there was a really significant amount of surviving sort of fabric. But of course, what happens in difficult economic and sort of social conditions after such a sort of long period of war, an emphasis on economic regeneration, as we would call it now, an emphasis on trying to find employment for people, and the real harm to this particular sort of property, yes, of course, it was caused initially by the incendiary bombs, but then it was in the post-war period where, as part of an employment sort of programme, people were set to work to dismantle it completely, take it down, a building that was eminently sort of capable of being restored to sort of full life. So it's not just in the early days of UNESCO sort of thinking about protection of cultural property in terms of times of war, but also the focus in the post-war period started to sort of turn onto the what happened next bit. And that was perhaps sort of crystallised in relation to World Heritage by the construction of the Aswan High Dam in Egypt. There was an earlier sort of dam, earlier in the sort of 20th century, which created a reservoir, but the Aswan High Dam, much more substantial engineering operation, which was going to have the effect of completely flooding the temples at Abu Simbel and leaving them permanently below the water level of the reservoir. So that sparked a sort of international sort of collaboration, and at that point there was no way of actually sort of stopping the dam going ahead to protect the archaeological remains. So the international sort of collaboration focused around a programme of recording, careful dismantling, and the re-erection of the site that you see there above the water level of the new reservoir. So what you are looking at there is the sort of complete reconstruction in an altered location of the original sort of temple site. So not bad as a plan B, but it did crystallise international thinking on this was not an isolated event. As economies started to sort of boom and develop in the post-war period, particularly in the 1960s, these pressures on heritage from infrastructure development, redevelopment and so forth became very evident indeed. So the focus moved on to those, and it was in 1972 when what we now call the World Heritage Convention, the formal title you see at the top of the slide there, came into being. The UK ratified that convention in 1984, and there are now 193 countries that have signed up to it, so almost as many as belong to UNESCO itself. And it's run on a similar basis. It has a General Assembly of the states parties that have signed and legally put into force the World Heritage Convention. They elect a 21-member committee which aims to achieve a geographical balance across the world. In UNESCO terms, the world is divided into 5 regions, and the voting system tries to ensure that there is a balance from all 5 regions with no one part of the world predominating over another. And it is this committee that takes strategy and policy decisions, as well as inscribing new World Heritage sites on the list, and also where there are sort of problems that are affecting the state of conservation of these World Heritage sites. There is the World Heritage in Danger list, which is meant to act as a catalyst for action to address the problems that have been identified. So just pulling out a few relevant parts of the convention, one of the sort of key elements is the wording that you see here, and it's worth reminding ourselves that the World Heritage Convention isn't just about cultural heritage, as we would regard it, archaeology and the historic environment. It's also about natural heritage as well. And from that point of view, back in 1972, it was quite ahead of its time in many ways of recognising that nature and culture are 2 sides of the same coin, and they should really be dealt with in an integrated way rather than separately. And while I think that principle is generally accepted, we in this country still struggle with that to a degree, with government agency level, Natural England, responsible for the natural environment, Historic England, or when people were searching around for a name for the new organisation, Unnatural England was suggested, that there's still the division between those two. And if, for example, you looked at the 25-year environment plan that was published last week, that is overwhelmingly on the natural side. It needed considerable efforts to try and get cultural heritage in there as well. We had some success, but not as much as we might have wished for. But in signing up to the World Heritage Convention, governments are committing themselves to using the utmost of their own resources, as you'll see from that slide, to identify it, to care for it, to transmit its value to this and future generations. So that word utmost sets the bar at a pretty high level. So there are significant obligations that come with that. The other sort of key element, obviously relating to this, is that while there is the recognition that each country is responsible for its own heritage, by signing the convention, you're recognising that there are some elements of our heritage which are of more than national importance, and where collaboration across different countries, interaction with other heritage agencies that have got particular experience, this sort of shared international working to sort of care for the heritage as best possible is a key element of the convention. And the other thing, which again I think for 1972 was quite advanced, was that there was this specific top line you see there about giving the cultural and natural heritage a function in the life of the community. this was at a time where, certainly in this country, sort of heritage was sort of managed by sort of people emanating from government departments, sort of going out to different parts of the country and saying, this is what you need to do, and going away again. The concept that the people who actually lived in that place and worked in that place might want to have something to do with the sort of care of their own heritage hadn't really sort of entered the frame. And in the UK, and not the UK alone, it's really only in the last 20 years or so, and particularly since the establishment of the Heritage Lottery Fund, that the idea of community participation and engagement in heritage has sort of come much more to the play. And at the same time, it has climbed up the World Heritage agenda as well. And from the World Heritage Committee's sort of point of view, this is seen as an absolutely sort of critical element, which is why, as you can see from that sort of bottom paragraph, there is a really vigorous sort of concentration on it. So in terms of the convention itself, where we stand now, you can see there are just over 1,000 World Heritage sites. And you can see what looks like a real imbalance between the cultural ones and the natural ones, and the ones that are mixed are those which have value for both culture and nature, which can be regarded as outstanding. But if you look at it in a slightly different way, then those 206 natural World Heritage sites often encompass very large geographical areas. In some cases, you might have 100,000 hectares of rainforest, where on the cultural side, you might have somewhere like the Tower of London, a specific defined monument. So it's not quite as unbalanced as it actually looks. And in the context of what we'll be sort of moving on to shortly this evening, there are just over 200 cities on the World Heritage list, and many more World Heritage sites are located in urban locations. So about sort of 20% or so of World Heritage sites are ones that have this distinctive urban context, which raises sort of particular challenges in a present day context. So if we then broaden out and sort of look at things which I'm sure are familiar to you here, but again, perhaps just refreshing the memory. It's only relatively recently, I can't remember the exact date, but about 15 years or so ago, when more than 50% of the world's population was defined as being living in cities rather than rural areas. So there's been this fantastic sort of shift in population from rural to urban. And also the exponential growth in world population. And you see the figures there and the sort of projections. And together with these sort of vast increases in population, the move towards urban living continues. So that is where the suggestion that by sort of 2050, maybe up to 70% of a much enlarged population would live in cities has come from. And obviously this poses huge challenges both to cultural and natural heritage. Now those challenges exist in any city, not just World Heritage cities, but if you cannot sort of get it right in a World Heritage city, what chance do you have of getting it right elsewhere? And the UN has been particularly alert to this context, and the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and the new Urban Agenda are particular sort of efforts to address some of these issues. And I'm going to look at those and the Habitat 3 and New Urban Agenda in a little bit more sort of detail over the next few slides. But there has been this emphasis on sort of policy sort of level with UNESCO working with its larger sister organisation, the UN, to try to ensure that cultural and natural heritage actually assume a sort of rightful place in the sort of policy sort of making at the sort of wider sustainable development level. And so one of the things that was hugely helpful was that in this 2030 agenda, amongst the 17 Sustainable Development Goals is Goal 11, which you can see set out for you there, and a sentiment that I think we would all support. So it may not be explicit, but it's certainly implicit in there that cultural heritage and natural heritage indeed is an essential part of being able to reach that goal. But as it's not explicit, then clearly UNESCO needed to do some more work, which is where Habitat 3 and the new urban agenda sort of come into being. And it's one of those things where you look at the figures and the rest of it, and you think a UN conference on housing and sustainable development in Mexico a couple of years ago, involving over the course of it 30,000 people from 167 countries. And it's just amazing, I think, that anything emerges from that at all. But it did, and you can see in the wording that you've got there, this sort of commitment to trying to sort of ensure that all the aspects that we would recognise in those words there can be sort of played into the sustainable development agenda and used really positively in terms of social participation in the exercise of citizenship, as you can see from that bottom line there. So a significant policy development on the international stage. And if you look at the global report on culture and sustainable urban development, you can pick out some sort of quotations which I would hope are pretty much unarguable. There's time for discussion afterwards, so if people sort of disagree, then that's absolutely fine. But I think there are some really good sort of lines in here, and I do really like that sort of top one, that, without the cultural sort of element, merely concrete and steel constructions prone to social degradation and fracture. That seems to be, absolutely sort of right. And it's great from my personal perspective, and I hope yours as well, to see this sort of recognition in multilateral organisations like UNESCO, to see it in their documentation. So what are the relevant UNESCO activities that sort of play into this? There are 6 conventions that relate to sort of culture, and they are on tangible and intangible heritage. And you can see again, I won't read it all out here because you've got it in front of you, but there are also networks that they establish. So the Creative Cities Network, Learning and Smart Cities Initiative, Protection of Historic Urban Landscape, and that latter I will sort of come back to and talk about in considerably more detail a bit later on. But these networks are very good in terms of sort of sharing common experience and practice and enabling one country to sort of learn from another, and the sort of two-way sort of flow of information it can be immensely sort of helpful. So as I mentioned earlier on, if we now sort of focus a bit more on urban world heritage, there are those just over 200 cities on the World Heritage List and other World Heritage sites that are located within them. And most of these are affected to some degree by the pace and the scale of change that I've just been summarising in the first part of this talk. And as I said earlier on, this is only a tiny proportion when we're looking at World Heritage cities, but if we can't get cultural and natural heritage to contribute to sustainable urban development in these very special places, what chance do we have of sort of making the case in places that may be hugely significant in national terms, in local terms, but not have the sort of kudos of that World Heritage Site status? So, one or two examples of things that are going on the ground. Istanbul is one of those extraordinary places, and I have to confess here a level of frustration because 18 months or so ago, the World Heritage Committee met in Istanbul, and I was part of the UK delegation to the committee, and I thought, fantastic, I've not been to Istanbul. Here is the opportunity to sort of really see one of these sort of amazing sort of cities on the sort of nexus between sort of Asia and Europe. World Heritage Committee meetings are intensive affairs, and they don't let up for about sort of 5 or 6 days, and we were just getting to the sort of point when there was going to be some free time over the weekend to really sort of start exploring things, but then that Friday night there was the attempted military coup, and there was no chance of doing that, and on the Monday, I left Istanbul without really having had a proper chance to explore the city. I will go back. But it does crystallise some of those issues that I was talking about earlier on. First of all, look at the sort of population side of things and see, again, this phenomenal growth. I find it personally quite hard to sort of get my head around the idea that in 16 years you see an increase in population of almost 4 million, and the sort of sheer scale of a city of 14.6 million as shown by those sort of figures there. And then you have that interacting with the outstanding heritage of the place. This is taken from the UNESCO Statement of Outstanding Universal Value, which is on the World Heritage Centre website, and sets out, this is just one extract from it, some of the reasons why the historic core of Istanbul is a World Heritage Site. So how does the World Heritage Site cope with that level of sort of population growth? What is the sort of effect on the sort of pre-existing historic core of the city? And it's not surprising that there have been some real problems with this. And over the last 20 years or so, there has been a huge amount of interaction between the World Heritage Committee and its advisory bodies and the Turkish government and the Istanbul authorities. And you can see here just one example of where the World Heritage Committee was particularly concerned about a piece of infrastructure that is clearly essential for the city in terms of sort of keeping it going. And I think with the sort of illustration that you see at the bottom there, which was taken after the sort of completion of this metro line sort of bridge across the Golden Horn, and even though the sort of vertical elements of the bridge have been significantly reduced from how they were originally planned, you can see from this sort of viewpoint how the view to the sort of mosque is sort of completely sort of compromised in that angle. And again, with this population growth, you need the infrastructure. And so you have this sort of phenomenal thing, 58 hectares of a sort of meeting area, potential to hold up to 1 million people, and completely sort of changing, the footprint of this part of the peninsula. And at that point, potentially sort of leaving one of the sort of key historic buildings in the area in the central reservation of an enlarged road. And it's been detailed interaction between World Heritage Committee, its advisory bodies, and the Istanbul and sort of Turkish authorities that is trying to sort of find as good a way as possible through this. And there have been some losses, but also there have been some gains, and things that might otherwise have been completely sort of compromised have not been so compromised, almost entirely off the back of the World Heritage Site status. So that's sort of one type of issue. But then, of course, from our, or certainly my perspective, a very sort of westernized sort of view of the world, used to the English planning system, used to the fact that in England and the UK more widely, there's been some form of heritage sort of protection legislation in place since 1882, things we really sort of take for granted. but in some other parts of the world, there are, of course, completely sort of different sort of cultures and philosophies, which is essential for our sort of diversity. But it does throw up particular sort of issues. And if you just look, again, this is taken from the UNESCO World Heritage Centre website, look at these sort of few lines describing a city in Uzbekistan. And if you note within that the reference to traditional houses that are built there, absolutely a sort of part of the outstanding universal value of this particular place. So let's look at what has happened there recently. Also in that description there were references to, if you like, the set-piece monuments that exist. Now those tend to exist down this sort of long sort of access through there. And the municipal authorities in this city thought, we've got these wonderful set pieces, you can't actually sort of see them and appreciate them all that well. We're trying to sort of grow our tourism industry because this is sort of part of the sort of Silk Road's network. And they're surrounded by these rather sort of tatty, rather sort of scruffy sort of buildings that detract from the magnificence of the monumental structures. So for reasons that were sort of entirely sort of understandable there, something happened which I think feels pretty horrific from my perspective. I've not actually been there, but the aerial photographs I think speak for themselves. So there's the situation in 2014. 2015, that's as the removal of the historic housing that is an integral part of the World Heritage Site to create the space around these sort of major monuments. And then the urban park that was sort of created there provides what the local authorities there thought was the right thing to do in terms of presenting their heritage to the increasing numbers of visitors. So what has actually happened there is not far short of 20% of the sort of core of the historic town has been taken out. And there is now a real issue about whether the World Heritage Site retains sufficient integrity to retain its World Heritage Site status. So there are hugely sort of challenging sort of issues such as that. That's a particularly stark example. But of course, there is the whole issue of resources as well. And I think many people in the heritage sector in this country feel very hard done by after over 7 years of austerity, cutbacks in funding to sort of heritage and so forth. But by comparison with so many countries, particularly in Africa, parts of Asia, Latin America, the resources we have after 7 years of austerity are ones that could scarcely be dreamed of by some of those other countries. So there is that level of awareness as well. So as part of the way in which UNESCO seeks to assist all sort of countries that are signed up to the World Heritage Convention, and indeed more broadly, they developed the Historic Urban Landscape recommendation, and that is a recommendation to the member countries of UNESCO. And this was finally put into place after a lot of deliberation back in 2011. And it sets out what I think is a really good sort of template, a strategic framework for the management of urban world heritage. So I'll just run through some of the sort of key points. And again, I think for heritage people in this room, the baseline of having proper information, proper surveyed information, mapped information is an essential sort of starting point. Then looking at how you might be able to build consensus on the processes of change that could affect that cultural and natural heritage through the participatory sort of planning process, actually sort of engaging local communities properly, and what values is it that they want to protect, trying to bring together expert views with sort of community sort of views and looking at how that might be done. then, the process, having done that, of assessing the vulnerability of these attributes that convey heritage value to the economic demands of regeneration, employment growth, and of course things such as the impact of sort of climate change. How can one sort of care for these sort of very elements that are the essence of a place in the face of these challenges? So it's looking at how you integrate urban heritage values into the wider framework of city development, and sort of putting cultural and natural heritage up there right alongside economic and social pillars. So a three-legged sort of stool with the environment angle explicitly including cultural heritage, not just sort of natural heritage, and trying to ensure that proper weight is given to those elements in the process of change, which every city sort of goes through and has always gone through. I think what we have now is the special nature of the change because of the sheer scale of it by comparison with some of what's gone before. So if you do that, you can then sort of prioritise areas for sort of conservation and what can be done, and you can look at establishing the partnerships and local management sort of frameworks that try to ensure that you can actually conserve in the long term those elements that have been identified as sort of carrying particular sort of value. And this is all clearly set out, albeit in UNESCO language, which takes a little bit of getting used to. It's all set out fairly sort of clearly in there, and you'll see things that will be very familiar to you in terms of public and sort of private sort of partnerships and collaborations and the engagement of civil society. So that's one tool, if you like, a policy sort of tool that has been offered up by UNESCO. And then there is another that is more detailed and sort of comes down to the sort of level of individual development proposals. And this is the Heritage Impact Assessment guidance that has been produced by ICOMOS. ICOMOS, the International Council on Monuments and Sites, is one of the three formally appointed advisory bodies to the World Heritage Committee, and it is the body that advises on sort of cultural heritage. And these guidelines take a specific look at the impact of development proposals on the outstanding universal value and the attributes of World Heritage sites. And again, there's a methodology established here, which seems to me to be perfectly sort of logical and sensible. You establish the scope at the outset, what is the scale of this project, what is the likely sort of impact on it, what are the sort of heritage values that are going to be affected. So you get it scoped out at the start. You integrate it so far as possible within the planning systems of whichever country you happen to be in. So in England, the advice would be to include a summary statement about the impact on the outstanding universal value of a World Heritage property in the environmental statement, if there is going to be one, or if it's not the scale of scheme that requires an environmental statement, then the design and access statement, which are a requirement of all planning applications. And to these should be appended the detailed report that sort of sets out what those impacts are in more detail. So that is attached as a technical appendix. So we've got these sort of helpful sort of elements with the historic urban landscape recommendation influencing strategic planning and the ICOMOS Heritage Impact Assessment guidelines looking at how one might handle specific development cases. So let's now move on with looking at a few cases within the sort of UK and what actually sort of happens and what some of the challenges are. So Bath was inscribed as a World Heritage Site 30 years ago, particularly because of the outstanding Roman remains around the hot springs, but also because of the planned layout of the Georgian town, the generosity of the spaces, and the interrelationship of the town with the wider landscape. Bath, if you know it, sits in this sort of green bowl effectively. So those are sort of some of the values of the site. But then you have particularly sort of difficult and contentious issues that come up. For those of you who are rugby fans, this is the recreation ground, or the Rec, which has a significant history all of its own, and it is one of the relatively few rugby grounds that sits right in the heart of an historic city. And it is hugely important to the economy of the town and the feel of the town. But, you know, guess what? Over the last little bit, rugby has become rather more popular, and the ground at the moment has a capacity of about 10, 11,000. The club, to put itself on a sustainable footing and to cope for the demand, needs 18,000 seats. So the next slide is not a current scheme. This was a sort of proposal from a couple of years back. But the sort of scale that might be necessary is indicated there, and you can see sort of very clearly from that, you know, the interference, you know, by comparison with the sort of previous slide, where you can see from the sort of banks of site straight into the town, and also more importantly from the town, from the sort of street that you have running along there. You get the views out over the recreation ground, and you've got the sort of green backdrop, which is an important element of the OUV. So if you put a stand like that in the way, you know, then there is clearly significant compromise to the heritage values of the place. So there will be a really sort of fascinating thing there in terms of how the sort of needs of one important historic component of the town and its economy is balanced with the sort of need to protect its universal values. So watch this space over time. And likewise, in Edinburgh, the old and new towns, World Heritage Site, and the new town element, again, because of this sort of remarkable sort of early sort of town planning and the sort of generosity of the layout. Before Edinburgh was a World Heritage Site, the greatly unloved St James's Centre, which you see here, was inserted, and there is absolute sort of unanimity that that is a real blot on the urban landscape and should be removed. So agreement on that. Rather less agreement on doing it like this. Now, most of that scheme works pretty well in terms of sort of materials and the rest of it in relation to the old town, but there is this architectural vanity sort of project, if you like, the sort of hotel element. If you look it up on the sort of website, if you look up the St James's Centre, there's a wonderful description of that sort of gold element, which I can't use as I'm being recorded, or I can sort of tell you afterwards. But, you know, that is a real problem because it's an architectural statement that is setting itself up in competition, you know, with the historic legacy of the place, and doing it in a way that I think many people would not regard as adding any sort of significant value, but rather potentially detracting from it. So you have issues like that. And then closer to home in Westminster, one of the sort of elements of the Westminster World Heritage Site that gives it particular value is what's listed in the Statement of Outstanding Universal Value as the iconic skyline. And sort of part of that, when you're in sort of Parliament Square, over on the left-hand side here, you've got this quite distinctive gap between the Queen Elizabeth Tower with Big Ben on the top and Portcullis House, and therefore you can see the sort of full height of the Queen Elizabeth Tower. You can at the moment, but from certain areas within the square, the redevelopment of Elizabeth House, which is what you see on the right-hand side here, will effectively close quite a lot of that sort of gap there. It doesn't necessarily come up all that high, but it is a significant intervention in that iconic urban landscape. And this has been the sort of subject of missions, to use the technical jargon, from UNESCO and its advisory bodies. And just before sort of concluding, I'm almost there, May, I can't help but tell a little story that we took members of the mission up to the top of the clock tower, and the guy who looked after the clock was telling us about all the technical detail. And he then also went on to sort of point out, the famous pennies that are sort of balanced on the mechanism to keep it in sort of time, and confessed that they got into huge trouble 3 years ago because they liked to send out an April Fool email to members of Parliament. And for this particular one, they sent out an email informing members of Parliament that the pennies had been replaced with euros. Some MPs didn't have a sense of humour. So there are those issues, and most prominently at the moment we have Liverpool, which is on the list of World Heritage Endangered that I mentioned earlier on because of a very large development called Liverpool Waters. This is the entrance to the 19th century dock system designed by the great engineer Jesse Hartley, and the Victoria sort of clock tower with its clock faces, which when they were working were giving times in different parts of the world, innovative dock technology, and the proposal that was given planning permission a few years ago has the potential to affect not only that, but also the 3 pierhead buildings, the Royal Liverpool Assurance Building, the Cunard Building, and the Port of Liverpool Building. And if you just look at the sort of scale of those in that historic photograph, and if I then show you the image of Liverpool Waters, you can just about pick out there, that is the Liver Building, the one on the left there, completely sort of dwarfed by Shanghai on Mersey. So these proposals are, particularly sort of problematical at the moment. There is a significant risk that Liverpool may lose its World Heritage Site status, and therefore one of the things that I would sort of conclude with is that there is a real problem in putting some of those sort of policies that I've been talking about into practice, and very often expediency and short-termism can undermine them. Because if you are the mayor of Liverpool and you have an investor that comes along and says, I'm putting £5.5 billion into this city and I will be creating this many jobs, it's quite hard to resist. And if that developer says, and it's got to be done like this, rather than done in a way that could perfectly well be accommodated in a way that was sensitive to the values of the World Heritage Site, then you've got a sort of difficult problem. So the tools, such as the Historic Urban Landscape Recommendation and the Heritage Impact Assessment, are there to be used, but decision makers quite often will override those because of the sort of short-termism. So I think what we need to do about that is we need to sort of up the sort of communication, we need to up the advocacy, particularly with those people who are taking decisions, and try to sort of emphasize that in terms of long-term sustainable growth of cities, you put all of that at risk if you sort of trash your cultural sort of heritage in the interests of short-term gain. And one of the ways in which decision makers might be more influenced than they are at the moment will be the increasing engagement of civil society. And in Liverpool, there is now a civil society organisation which tries to represent the views of the people who live within the World Heritage Site, who work within the World Heritage Site. And they're saying, look, you can have it both ways. You can retain the heritage values, you can secure investment and jobs and growth and new development, but you can't do it if you have a master plan like Liverpool Waters. So what I would suggest we need in this country is to promote the means by which these, what I would say are sort of excellent sort of policies and practice can be implemented effectively within the planning provisions that we have at the moment. And on that point, I've overrun a little bit. I'll stop. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Henry. A very fascinating and in-depth explanation of the tools that are available and how they can be misused, actually, or ignored.
Yes.
Even. I'm sure there are questions for you. And could I remind everybody, please, to state your name and your affiliation. It actually helps Henry to position the question. So, who's going first? Please.
I wanted to ask if
your name, please.
Oh, I'm Chris Hudson. I'm a museum designer. I'm an honorary at the Institute of Archaeology. I wanted to ask if there was any legal obligations if a World Heritage Site is adopted, or is the relationship with UNESCO just consultative and the only sanction the withdrawal of their status?
Yeah, that UNESCO has no role in the planning system of any of the member countries to the World Heritage Convention. But the responsibility is actually on the national government of the countries that are signed up to it, because if we sort of think back to that Article 4 of the Convention, I mean, it is a legally binding obligation. It is open to interpretation what looking after your heritage to the utmost of your resources actually might be. You could probably put a load of lawyers in the room, they'd earn a lot of money arguing about what utmost actually meant. But there is that sort of legal obligation. But when it comes to sort of sanctions, the tools that the World Heritage Committee have are pretty limited. Stage 1 is asking for a state of conservation report, which means that the government in any particular country has to explain what is going on in a particular sort of World Heritage site. Depending on what that report says, it is then possible for the World Heritage Committee to place that site on the list of World Heritage in danger, like Liverpool, which is effectively saying, unless you change course on this, you're going to lose your World Heritage Site status. And then ultimately, if you don't do that, you can lose the World Heritage Site status. But those are pretty blunt instruments to sort of try and sort of achieve the sort of aims. Particularly in relation to urban World Heritage, we're trying to sort of manage the pace of change. And where there are some issues that very often the advisory bodies of the World Heritage Committee and the committee itself will take a more conservative approach to change and development than we might in this country and many other countries of the world might take as well. So there can be sort of tensions between sort of different philosophies. But really the convention depends on countries stepping up to the responsibilities they've signed up to, and they don't always do it.
Thank you.
Louise Bacon, retired. I just wondered, was there any financial impact to this? I mean, does there some sort of grants for works to the historic city come with your status? So if you do get sort of kicked out, do you lose a lot of money?
Yeah, there is no direct financial impact unless you're one of those sort of countries that has little capacity, struggling economy, where the World Heritage Fund, which is provided in part through member contributions, member country contributions, that can be allocated to assist. And in those parts of the world, often there will be governments in more developed countries, more economically sort of prosperous countries, that will contribute to sort of conservation and other work. So that I have an Italian colleague who's advising the sort of government in Georgia on how they might strengthen their heritage protection systems. If you go to places like Angkor in Cambodia, you will see conservation works being paid for by the German government, by the Italian government, and so forth. Here in the UK, it is a case of not getting any money directly as a result of the status, but if you are applying for a Heritage Lottery Fund grant or another source of funding, the fact that you are a World Heritage Site can be sort of played into your application very effectively. And World Heritage Site status, what value financially you get out of it, really depends on the sort of use you make of it. And there have been a number of studies, and particularly by a man called James Rebanks, who's a sheep farmer in the Lake District, whose second job is advising on how communities can benefit financially and socially from World Heritage Site status. So that's about things like promoting sort of sustainable tourism, encouraging people to stay longer and spend more. So the benefits, particularly the financial ones you get, tend to sort of come not directly from the status, but as a result of harnessing it to the maximum possible advantage.
You were talking about...
Your name?
Oh, sorry. Mars O'Brien. I'm doing an MSc in urban regeneration here. I just wanted to... You talked about Uzbekistan and the destruction of, as you said, something like 20% of the old city. Do you think... What went wrong? Was it the communication that went wrong? Did they not ask, or did they not know who to speak to, or what?
I think it is communication, and there are sort of big differences between different countries, so that in the UK, if there is a contentious development proposal within a World Heritage Site, then it is not long usually before people will write to the World Heritage Centre in Paris saying, we think it's outrageous, it's a World Heritage Site, what are you going to do about it? Well, as we found out, previously UNESCO can't do a great deal, but they sort of flag it up. In countries like sort of Uzbekistan, that level of engagement from civil society is not quite so pronounced, and therefore there was no public alert, if you like. And as I say, I think entirely genuinely, the municipal authorities did not think they were doing anything that might be regarded as harmful to the heritage. They thought, I think genuinely, they were doing the right thing. So it's only when things like this sort of get flagged up that they come to prominence, and they're more likely to be sort of flagged up in the sort of countries with more developed civil society than in those where it's less so.
Is there any move towards trying to get essential communication networks, and so that the people who organise the planning in those communities can know who to talk to?
Yeah, there's quite a lot of that goes on, and in particular one of the advisory bodies to the World Heritage Committee, ICROM, sort of formerly the International Conservation Centre in Rome, does a lot of capacity building work in those parts of the world that would appear to sort of need it most. And those needs can be identified by the periodic reporting process on World Heritage Sites, where on a 5-yearly cycle, member states have to report on the condition of individual World Heritage Sites and the across-the-board condition of all the World Heritage Sites in that particular country. So that tends to sort of flag up where some of the issues are, so that can then provide a sort of focus for where ICROM will work with the government and relevant authorities in the place concerned, and conduct sort of training sort of programs and sort of build the capacity that way.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, I'm Sophie Hetherington from the Heritage Consultant from Turley. Are there ever occasions where UNESCO decides not to designate a World Heritage Site because of the potential damage that high-level tourist football and the associated buildings would do?
Yes, relatively few specific to sort of tourism, although that is sort of climbing right up the agenda, and there is the issue at the moment that tourism is now always preceded by the word sustainable, but whether it actually is sustainable or not is very often a sort of moot point. But there are 3 pillars to outstanding universal value. The sort of first one is, does it have the heritage significance? The second one is, does it have authenticity and integrity? Is it a real place? Does it retain physically the fabric that sort of tells the sort of special history of the place? And the third one is protection and management. And what the World Heritage Committee and its advisory bodies are saying increasingly now is that all three pillars constitute outstanding universal value. Therefore, even if the first two are there, if the protection and management regime is not sufficient to protect the first two, then the place will not be regarded as having outstanding universal value, and it will not be inscribed on the World Heritage List. So that is being enforced more rigorously. But it's at that sort of overall protection and management level, which again can be a bit difficult because you need to be able to sort of demonstrate, if you're not going to inscribe it on the World Heritage List, that the tourism is so unregulated and uncontrolled that it is going to sort of undermine the long-term protection and management of the site. But there are places where that is the case, and I think we'll see more and more of it.
Thank you. Shuri, I'm a student in this institute. You mentioned that sometimes the World Heritage sites undergo changes which threaten their integrity. Has it ever happened till date that any city or a site has lost its title because of this change?
It's happened in two cases only. There was a natural heritage site, the Arabian Oryx sanctuary, which was in Kuwait, where there were problems in the management of that, and the oryx population, which was meant to be protected, went into sort of near terminal decline, and so the value was lost there. And then on the cultural heritage site, the construction of a large new bridge in the Dresden Elbe Valley in Germany led to the deletion of that site from the World Heritage List. So it can happen. It's a last resort, and within the UK we're working as hard as we can to try to prevent Liverpool becoming a member of such an undistinguished club.
I'm Kayo Fuseki. I am one of the lecturers at the Institute for Sustainable Heritage. It's obvious that the existing tools do not work. And you mentioned that engagement of civil society is one way for them to work, although so far the civil society is engaged once the problem occurs. So we need to do something before the problem occurs and engage with the civil society. And you mentioned that I found very interesting one of the bullet points in the end about advocacy, the need to advocate.
Yeah.
So I would like to ask, is there a scope maybe for the emergence of a new profession within the heritage sector, like dedicated people who will be the advocates, who will undertake that role, which is a time-consuming role, and who will orchestrate all the different planners, all the different decision makers, policy makers, and do that on a permanent basis, not just on an ad hoc basis once the problem occurs, but before the problem occurs, and try to integrate that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a fantastic idea, and it's absolutely what should happen. We're sort of really stuttering in the UK in being able to achieve that. There is an umbrella body for the UK's World Heritage sites, World Heritage UK, which has advocacy sort of high on its list, and it is starting to do a sort of very good job. But it is a small charity with a very low level of resources, and I think it's about how one can sort of resource organisations like that effectively in order to do exactly what you say, so that it can be approached at a strategic level rather than always sort of firefighting when it's too late.
Solutions within reach. I've been responsible for working from probably half a dozen to a dozen major urban regeneration projects, advising clients and developers on how best to maintain and increase the value of the investment. And one of the characteristics of good projects and successful projects has been where there has been an informed client who has taken biggest benefit for the longest period of time, so that they no longer are just construction projects,
Yeah.
but that there is actually long-term value. And in that sort of situation, we can get the benefit of heritage plus all the other sustainable elements that are currently within the UK planning regime, but which are being eroded, I would suggest, through by lobbying from an industry which isn't quite as rigorous and as profitable as it could be and should be.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree with that. And a few years ago, when the Culture, Media and Sport Select Committee took one of its rare forays outside of London, it went to Liverpool, and the chief executive of Liverpool Vision, the development company there, was asked by one of the sort of committees what developers felt about sort of heritage. Did they see it as an obstruction or a benefit? And he said, I think quite accurately, that the type of developer that wants to sort of go in quickly, get out quickly, maximise the sort of profit, and doesn't really sort of care what happens next, will always see it as an obstruction. The type of clients that you have are the sort of people who can see it as a... But the ones you... The good ones you reference, do absolutely sort of recognise that if you're in it for the sort of long term, then there are real benefits that can come to that sort of company through their sort of early engagement, investment sort of in heritage and so forth. It's how one sort of tries to sort of encourage more and more of the latter and fewer of the former.
Okay, we'll take one last question.
Alejandra Werner, I'm a lecturer at the Institute for Sustainable Heritage. You mentioned the UN Sustainable Development Goals and how heritage is mentioned under Goal 11, which focuses on cities. But to the best of my knowledge, there's no other mention of heritage in any of the other goals.
Yeah.
Do you think there is a shortfall there?
Yes, absolutely. And as we saw with Article 11, it's sort of more implicit than explicit. But I think it had proved such an uphill sort of battle to sort of get anything at all. The fact that there is Article 11, yes, there's a deficit, but it is a case of sort of trying to gain maximum advantage from the sort of inclusion of heritage under the Article 11 banner. And I think UNESCO sort of deserves credit because it has actually been doing that. And I think, will continue to do so more and more. So I think it is getting cultural and natural heritage more sort of mainstream in the sort of sustainable development thinking. But yes, it would have been great if there'd been more.
On that note, can you please join me with another round of applause for Henry? Thank you.